All right, so welcome to our final week of actual meetings for political ideologies. We're going to have a busy week coming up since we are at the end of the course. So for this week, focus on the readings that we have. We'll talk about the first two today, the last four tomorrow, which are all in the same theme of Islamism. So today we're going to talk about liberation theologies as well as environmentalism in the two readings that we have for today. All right, so over the course of the next week, the things that you have coming up. So you have a final discussion board on the readings that we have for this week. So the focus of the discussion board is going to be on one of the readings that we have today. You can obviously add things from other readings or any other sources that you think would help. Focus on that discussion board first. We have that due on the usual timeline. So your response by Saturday midnight, your classmate response by Monday at midnight. We also have the final exam, which will be released tomorrow. All right, so the way the final exam works, it's an essay format. So I offer you 4 questions, you choose 3. So the 3 that you're most comfortable answering are the 3 that, that you'll stick to. All right, so if you do all 4, you don't get any extra credit or anything like that. So only do 3 answers to the questions. All right. Your answers to those questions should be longer than your typical discussion board response. So I have in the document, they should be at least 500 words. So I would say at least a page and a half for each answer for each of the 3 that you're giving. The questions that you have on the final are not exclusive to any particular week. So what they ask you to do is to compare readings across weeks, compare different themes, different things that we've talked about. So it's really up to your interpretation, how you want to answer those questions. All right. So they're fairly open-ended given that they are essay, but they are all things that we have talked about in this class. So you may want to go back and look at the virtual meetings that we've had, go look back at the texts. Everything that you need for the final will be on Canvas. All right. You can obviously use any outside sources as well if you think that they're helpful and they'll add to your response. All right. So that's the gist of what we have coming up with those assignments. So like I said, you'll have a busy next few days. The final exam will be due next Tuesday at noon. So the reason that that's due so soon is because I only have a limited amount of time to actually grade things for the course. So I will need to submit final grades by the end of next week. All right, so things will be moving fairly quickly. I'll try to get your grades back on everything as soon as possible as well. One other thing is that I do have an opportunity for extra credit for the whole class. So you should soon have the spot surveys released for this course. So the course evaluations will be released in MyFIU shortly. If we get at least 75% of the course to answer those by next Thursday, I'll give everybody an extra percentage point on their final grade. All right, so make sure that you fill those out. Again, if we have 75% of the course fill them out, everybody will get an extra credit point. All right, so that's something to look out for. I'll try to send a notice about those spot surveys. I'm not sure if they're available yet, but they should be shortly if they aren't yet. But I'm giving you about a week to do that as the whole class. And if we get at least 75%, you'll all get an extra bonus point on your final grade, which can be the difference. So, if you're at an 89%, and you're at a B+ and you want to get an A-, that could tip the balance. All right, so make sure that you do those spot surveys. All right, without further ado, I want to get into the readings for this week. So the first one that we'll talk about is this Vine Deloria Jr. reading on liberation. So Vine Deloria is a Native American activist, author, academic. And really what he tried to do within this reading and some of his other texts is to alter human thinking away from a Western narrow focus, all right? Which is really something that you see that's common with this whole idea of liberation ideology. Sometimes it's called liberation theology as well when you put it in a more religious context. But liberation ideologies are about focusing on those perspectives of people who are often marginalized, who are oppressed, who are poor, and focusing on the concerns of those groups. All right, and that's one of the things that we see here in the Deloria piece. Again, coming from a Native American background, that's a population that is oftentimes marginalized. Oftentimes, Native American culture is, is subverted to a lot of Western ideas, and that's one of the things that he's trying to break from within this piece. All right, so let's look at a few passages within the text to better understand it. So I want to look first at the opening of the text. So if you look at the first few sentences, Deloria writes, liberation theology assumes that the common experience of oppression is sufficient to create the desire for a new coalition of dissident minorities. Adherents of this movement indiscriminately classify all minorities, racial, ethnic, and sexual, in a single category of people seeking liberation. All right, so again, people who are often marginalized. So he mentions different racial, ethnic, sexual groups who may be marginalized for particular factors. All right, it may not be seen as compatible or whatever with Western ideas of how things typically work. All right, if we go to the end of that paragraph, then he continues to describe what he means by this phrase, liberation theology. And he says, liberation theology then was an absolute necessity in the establishment, if the establishment was going to continue to control the minds of minorities. If a person of a minority group had not invented it, the liberal establishment most certainly would have created it. All right. And again, he's saying here that a lot of these Western ideas that we have of things are meant to oppress certain groups and to keep them marginalized. All right, if we go to the beginning of the third paragraph then, Deloria writes, if there were any serious concern about liberation, we would see thousands of people simply walk away from the vast economic, political, and intellectual machine we call Western civilization and refuse to be enticed to participate in it any longer. Liberation is not a difficult task when one no longer finds value in a set of institutions or beliefs. We are liberated from the burden of Santa Claus and the moral demand to be good when, as maturing adolescents, we reject the concept of Santa Claus. All right, so what he's saying here is that these Western ideas, the Western customs and way of doing things should be rejected as a means to try to liberate these particular groups that he's talking about who are marginalized within that system. All right, so he's talking about a complete overhaul of how we think about society and how it should operate. And he's saying that doing so will help these groups that are oftentimes marginalized within the conventional norms and ways of doing things within Western society. All right. Okay, if we go a little bit further, 2 paragraphs further, Deloria then writes, all these questions arise, however, because of the fundamental orientation of Western peoples toward the world. We assume that we know the structure of reality and must only make certain minor adjustments in the machinery that operates it in order to bring our institutions into line. Immediate suffering is thus placed in juxtaposition with abstract metaphysical conceptions of the world, and because we see immediate suffering, we feel impelled to change conditions quickly to relieve tensions, never coming to understand how the basic attitude toward life and its derivative attitudes toward minority groups continues to dominate the goals and activities that appear designed to create reforms. All right. So again, what he's saying here is that these whole ideas of reforming the system, they haven't been working, and these groups still remain oppressed. One of the things you notice here probably with this whole idea of liberation ideology, liberation theology, is that there are some similarities to the Marxist ideology in terms of overthrowing the system, right? So where Marxism is talking about overthrowing the economic system, this whole idea of liberation theology is talking about overthrowing the Western norms and customs that we may have, okay? Because they're talking about groups that are oppressed, and that's common to both of these different types of ideologies, both to Marxism and liberation ideology. All right. All right, if we go a little bit later in the text, a little bit closer to the end, Deloria writes, once we reject the absolute nature of Western conceptions of problems, we're able to see the different types of questions inherent in our immediate problem areas. The immediacy we feel when observing conditions under which people live should enable us to raise new issues that contain within themselves new ways of conceiving solutions. So what he's saying here is that there's not only one way to do things, there are other ways of doing things. And many of these other social groups, those who are oppressed, may be able to offer new solutions that aren't embraced within a lot of the Western ideas that we've had for centuries. He goes on to say, an old Indian saying captures the radical difference between Indians and Western peoples quite adequately. The white man, the Indians maintain, has ideas. Indians have visions. Ideas have a single dimension and require a chain of connected ideas to make sense. All right. All right. So what he's saying here is that there's a different thought process between that of, who he refers to here as the white man and Native Americans. And he's saying that we should look at these different thought processes. He's not only saying necessarily, he's not simply saying to reject Western ideals and just to replace it with these other things. He's saying we should consider all different ways of thinking in terms of solving problems, because each particular societal group may have different problems. So you need to find different solutions to those problems. All right, and that's what he's trying to get at here with this point about embracing these other ways of thinking about things. All right, then if you go to the second to last paragraph in the text, Deloria later writes, if we are then to talk seriously about the necessity of liberation, we are talking about the destruction of the whole complex of Western theories of knowledge and the construction of a new and more comprehensive synthesis of human knowledge and experience. All right, so what he's getting at here is, once again, he's not necessarily saying to completely do away with all Western logic and thinking. He's saying it would be perhaps a better system to combine those ideas with all the other ideas that are out there from different cultures, different minority groups, different ways of thinking, all right? And to have a more comprehensive set of values and ways of thinking about collective problems, all right? And that's what he's trying to get at here with the text. And this is one of the things that's really at the heart of this whole idea of liberation ideology, all right? All right, if you have questions on this, feel free to type them in the chat box as we go. As I mentioned, this particular reading forms the basis for this week's discussion board. So pay attention to it. Pay attention to where Deloria is going with his points in the text. And that's really what will be the main area of what you're responding to, okay? All right, I want to get to the second reading for today. We're not going to go as long today because we only have the 2 readings. We'll have 4 tomorrow. We'll see how long we need to go for that. But the second reading I wanted to get to today is the one from Pope Francis on the environment. So Pope Francis is somebody who I'm sure you've probably heard has been outspoken on issues like climate change, on the environment. And this is a text from him regarding those issues. All right. It's called On Care for Our Common Home. And he focuses on a number of issues. It's not only the environment, but the environment is a major part and really was the inspiration for this particular text. All right. He talks about different problems like global inequality. If you've studied things like environmental policy, one of the things you see is about environmental justice. Those who are often within a lot of the poor economic conditions also experience poor environmental conditions. Things like air quality and such may be poorer in those areas. All right. All right, so I want to look at some passages within this text as well. So if we look at the beginning, if we look at where it says my appeal, where Pope Francis is talking about his appeal to his followers and basically anybody else who will read this text. The first thing that he writes is, the urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development, for we know that things can change. And the next paragraph he writes, I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. All right, so here he has a call to action. And he's not making this exclusive to Catholic followers or simply those within his church. As he says, this is an appeal to everyone, all right? Because he says it's our common home. So people of different faiths, people of different backgrounds, we all have this common home. So it is in our interest to protect our common home, that environment, all right? All right, if we go to the beginning of the next passage where he talks about global inequality, he then writes, the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. All right, that's basically the point that I was saying about environmental justice. Those who are the most vulnerable economically or in other ways also tend to be the most vulnerable to environmental consequences as well. All right, if we go a little bit later I'm not sure if they're numbered in your electronic piece, but point number 54, the Pope continues where he talks about the responses to this and the things that have been done in the past. And one of the things that he says is, it is remarkable how weak international political responses have been. The failure of global summits on the environment make it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. He then goes on in a later passage to say, in the meantime, economic powers continue to justify the current global system where priority tends to be given to speculation and the pursuit of financial gain, which fail to take the context into account, let alone the effects on human dignity and the natural environment. All right. So what he's getting at here is really the inaction in the political realm to these issues. If we think about politics, I'm sure some of you are international relations majors, and you may be familiar with some of these things like the different international agreements and summits that have been done on issues like climate change, on the environment. One of the things that we see is this tends to really be a priority, and not much of a priority. It tends to be more on the back burner, right? The environment as an issue. We had things like the Paris Accords and such, which are actually not really, they're voluntary. So states set their own standards with regard to the Paris Accords. It's basically just trying to put some emphasis on this issue, but there really is no enforcement mechanisms. And that's one of the things we see here. States really like to embrace their own sovereignty. They don't like to give that up to any sort of international agreement. All right, so that's one of the things that we see here. And that's what Pope Francis is getting into. In fact, the environment as an international issue, the first major summit was not held until 1972 with the Stockholm Conference. And that was the first major conference having to do with the environment, and still not much was actually accomplished at that meeting. They've held similar summits about every 10 years, but not much has really been done as far as any sort of international agreement on the environment. Environmental regulations tend to still be up to particular states. And then you have that collective action problem, right? So you have the issue of states working together. That's often very challenging because you have the freeloader issue where, okay, some states may try to reduce their emissions or protect the environment in certain ways, but then you have other states who think, well, I can get an economic benefit if I don't hold to those standards. All right, I can have an advantage over these other states who are imposing these things on themselves. That's where you run into issues here on issues like the environment. All right, if you go a little bit later in the text, it's labeled point 190 in my text. I'm not sure if it has the same within your electronic version, but you can also do a search and find for the words that I'm saying. Later on, the Pope writes, here too, it should always be kept in mind that environmental protection cannot be assured solely on the basis of financial calculations of costs and benefits. The environment is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces. All right, so what the Pope is saying here is that states do have a responsibility to step on in issues of environmental degradation. And he says that it's really an issue of market failure. It's not something that the market accounts for, the environment. Now, in some ways, you can make an argument that it perhaps does because of sustainability. So certain industries, of course, will be harmed through environmental degradation. But the environment tends not to be a foremost concern of most companies. That's a reason why you need government to provide regulations to protect the environment for everyone else within the society. All right, and that is a role for government. And perhaps some libertarian thinkers, we talked about libertarianism earlier, who, we talked about Murray Rothbard, who wanted essentially almost no government. He wanted minimal government. He saw it as government as an evil. He didn't even say a necessary evil. He said government is an evil. But a lot of libertarian thinkers believe that this is one area where the government actually needs to have some enforcement mechanisms with regard to the environment, with the belief that harming the environment also harms the ability of others to fully embrace their liberty. All right. So by polluting, you're also impacting the rights and liberties of others because you're affecting everybody else. We all share the same environment. We all share the air that we breathe, right? So the water that we drink, all of those things. So having those protections in place is necessary, according to many different ideologies, including many libertarian thinkers. All right, the last part that I want to get to is the last portion of the text, the last paragraph, where Pope Francis writes, And I'm going to read the full paragraph here. He says, politics and the economy tend to blame each other when it comes to poverty and environmental degradation. It is to be hoped that they can acknowledge their own mistakes and find forms of interaction directed to the common good. While some are concerned only with financial gain and others with holding on to or increasing their power, what we are left with are conflicts of spurious agreements where the last thing either party is concerned about is caring for the environment and protecting those who are most vulnerable. Here too, we see how true it is that unity is greater than conflict. All right, so what he's calling for here is unity on this issue. Because once again, it's an issue of collective action, right? Having states work together, having individuals work together at different levels. And if you read this piece, he doesn't really mention anything about theology or religion. I mean, he does mention our Creator, he mentions these different terms, but this is something that's meant to go beyond merely his Catholic followers, right? He's not using Catholic doctrine within this text. It's rather a call to action on environmental issues, which he believes align, of course, with his with the Catholic belief system, but he also argues that, you know, that it extends to everyone because we all share our common home, as the piece is entitled. All right. So that's really a synopsis of that piece. If you have additional questions, those of you who are logged in live, of course, you can type in the chat box and ask. Those of you who are watching this later, you can email me. I know we went a little short today. I basically just wanted to give you an overview of the assignments that you have coming up and go through those two texts. Tomorrow, we'll go through the ones on Islamism, which will be our last unit that we'll cover. All right. Make sure that you're doing the discussion boards during the week. I would suggest to get those in as soon as possible because you also have the final exam. All right, so I've already given you the tools that you need on this particular piece, which is the basis for the discussion board. Work on that, I would say, as soon as possible. Try to get that in. Once you see others responding, give your classmate response so that you have plenty of time for the final exam. I know things are a bit hectic and rushed at the end of the semester, but that's just how it works in a 6-week course like this. Because I want to get through as much as we would do in a typical 16-week course, but we have less time to do it. So make sure that you're working on those things. The final exam will be released tomorrow. I may give a few more instructions on that in our virtual meeting tomorrow as well. But with that, I'll leave it there for today, and I'll see you all tomorrow.